"You're fired." The words landed softly, but they seemed to echo against the high white ceiling of the nursery like something heavier than sound, and yet Amora Johnson didn't move because the little boy in her arms was still crying, his small fingers gripping the fabric of her grey uniform as if letting go meant falling into something deeper than fear. And outside the tall windows the late afternoon sky stretched pale and quiet across the rolling acres of the Whitmore estate, the manicured lawn glowing faintly under a soft October sun, while inside the room everything felt suspended in a fragile stillness broken only by Ethan Whitmore's uneven breathing, and Amora lowered herself slowly into the rocking chair near the window as if careful not to disturb the air itself, her movements measured, gentle, almost instinctive, because she had heard that kind of crying before, not loud or dramatic but tired and searching, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than a scraped knee or a bad dream, and she swayed slowly, just a few inches forward, a few inches back, the wooden chair creaking softly beneath her weight, while Ethan pressed his cheek against her shoulder, his warm breath dampening the collar of her uniform, and Daniel Whitmore stood frozen near the doorway, his tall silhouette framed by the soft hallway light, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight but his eyes focused not on her but on his son, and the room smelled faintly of baby lotion and polished wood, the quiet hum of the air vent blending with the distant sound of wind brushing against the maple trees outside, and Amora didn't look up, didn't speak, because sometimes words only made things louder, and instead she adjusted her grip slightly, one hand resting gently against Ethan's back, her palm moving in slow circles like a rhythm learned long ago, and Ethan's crying softened, not stopping yet, but loosening, like a knot beginning to give way, and the soft golden light slipping through the curtains touched the side of Amora's face, highlighting the calm in her expression, the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the quiet patience in the way she held him without urgency, and Daniel took one slow step forward, his shoes barely making a sound on the plush cream carpet, and for a moment it looked like he might speak again, might repeat the command, but he didn't, because Ethan's fingers tightened around Amora's sleeve, and the boy's breathing slowed just slightly, just enough to be noticed, and the mansion, usually filled with distant footsteps and muted voices, seemed to settle into a rare quiet, like the house itself was listening. And Amora continued to rock gently, her gaze drifting toward the wide windows where the sun dipped lower across the acres of land, the light softening into amber, and somewhere down the hallway a grandfather clock ticked slowly, marking seconds that felt longer than usual, and Daniel Whitmore remained still, watching, the tension in his shoulders slowly shifting into something quieter, something uncertain, as the crying softened again, the sound now barely above a whisper, and Ethan's small hand loosened just slightly against Amora's uniform, his breathing evening out, and the air in the room warmed almost imperceptibly, like something invisible had changed, and Amora kept rocking, steady and patient, as if she had nowhere else to be, as if the world outside the nursery could wait a little longer. Amora Johnson kept rocking slowly as the late afternoon light softened into a warm amber glow across the nursery walls, and Ethan Whitmore's breathing grew steadier against her shoulder, the small tremors in his chest fading one by one until the tension in his tiny fingers eased, and she felt the subtle weight shift as exhaustion finally began to pull him toward sleep, and she adjusted her arm carefully to support his head, her movements instinctive, practiced in a quiet way that came from years of learning patience instead of rushing, and the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser in the corner mixed with the clean smell of freshly folded blankets stacked neatly on a nearby chair, while the soft ticking of the grandfather clock down the hall seemed louder now in the stillness, and Daniel Whitmore remained near the doorway, his arms resting loosely at his sides, no longer rigid but not fully relaxed either, his eyes following every small movement as if afraid that any sound might break the fragile calm that had finally settled over the room, and Amora's gaze drifted toward the framed photograph on the dresser, a smiling woman sitting in the same rocking chair with Ethan as a newborn wrapped in a pale blue blanket, the sunlight in the photograph bright and warm, and she recognized the quiet absence that filled the space around it, the kind of absence that lingered in homes long after voices faded, and Ethan shifted slightly, pressing closer, his breathing now slow and even, and Amora felt the familiar ache in her chest that she had learned to carry quietly, the memory of her own son who used to fall asleep the same way, his small hand curled around her sleeve as if holding on to safety, and she blinked once, steadying herself, her rocking never stopping, never rushing, and the quiet hum of the air vent filled the silence as the sun dipped lower beyond the wide windows overlooking the long stretch of green lawn and distant oak trees, their leaves moving gently in the soft breeze, and Daniel took another careful step forward, his polished shoes sinking softly into the carpet, and he noticed something he had not seen in months. Ethan's face relaxed, his brow smooth, the tightness that usually lingered during restless sleep completely gone, and Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly as he watched, the quiet disbelief settling slowly across his features. And Amora continued to sway in small, steady motions, her hand moving gently along Ethan's back, counting breaths without thinking, feeling the rhythm settle into something peaceful, and the nursery, once filled with restless echoes, now felt warmer, quieter, almost suspended in a calm that seemed unfamiliar yet deeply needed. And Daniel glanced toward the window where the sky had shifted into soft gold fading into pale blue, and for the first time in weeks he did not hear the distant echo of hurried footsteps or anxious voices from the staff, only the quiet breathing of his son and the gentle creak of the rocking chair. And Amora leaned back slightly, careful not to disturb Ethan, her expression calm, her eyes soft as she watched the fading light, and the entire mansion seemed to settle into that quiet moment, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, and Daniel Whitmore stood there silently, watching a stranger bring a kind of peace into his home that money, specialists, and careful planning had never managed to create. And the stillness stretched gently across the room while Ethan slept deeper, his fingers finally loosening completely from Amora's sleeve, and the soft golden light rested across them both like something fragile and quietly hopeful. Daniel Whitmore finally exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for longer than he realized, and he stepped closer to the rocking chair with careful, measured movements, his eyes fixed on Ethan's peaceful face, still unfamiliar in its calm, and the fading sunlight stretched across the carpet in long golden lines while the shadows of the tall oak trees outside shifted gently against the walls, and Amora Johnson continued to rock softly, her breathing steady, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she understood how delicate the moment was. And Daniel stopped a few feet away, noticing the quiet details he had missed before, the way Ethan's shoulders were no longer tense, the way his small lips rested slightly parted in deep sleep, and the faint warmth in the room that had replaced the restless tension that usually lingered. And Daniel lowered his voice instinctively when he finally spoke, his tone quieter than before, almost cautious, asking, "How long has he been like this?" And Amora glanced up gently, her voice soft and calm as she answered, "Just a few minutes, sir. He was very tired." And Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words, his gaze drifting briefly toward the photograph on the dresser again, then back to his son, and the silence between them felt different now, less strained, more thoughtful, as if something unseen had shifted. And Amora carefully adjusted the blanket draped over the back of the chair, pulling it gently across Ethan's legs to keep him warm, her movement slow and respectful. And Daniel noticed the small gesture, the kind that came naturally rather than professionally, and he studied her for a moment, noticing her calm expression, the quiet steadiness in her posture, the absence of nervousness that he usually saw in new staff members around him, and the sound of distant footsteps briefly echoed from the hallway before fading again, leaving the room wrapped once more in gentle stillness. And Daniel spoke again, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "He does not usually fall asleep like this," and Amora nodded slightly, her gaze returning to Ethan. "Sometimes children just need someone to sit with them," she said softly, "not to fix anything, just to be there." And Daniel's expression shifted subtly at her words, the quiet honesty settling deeper than he expected, and he leaned slightly against the nearby dresser, his shoulders loosening as he continued watching Ethan's peaceful sleep. And outside the sky deepened into soft evening tones, pale blue fading into warm amber, and the long shadows stretched further across the nursery floor. And Amora slowed her rocking even more, careful not to disturb the stillness, her hand resting gently against Ethan's back as she counted his breaths without thinking. And Daniel noticed the rhythm, the patience in her movements, and he found himself standing there longer than he intended, drawn into the quiet calm that filled the room. And the mansion, usually echoing with distant activity, felt unusually quiet, as if the entire house had settled into the same gentle peace. And Daniel finally stepped closer, lowering his voice again, "You can place him in the bed if you like." And Amora nodded carefully, moving slowly as she rose from the rocking chair, supporting Ethan with practiced care, and she crossed the few feet to the small bed near the window, lowering him gently onto the soft mattress, adjusting the pillow beneath his head, and pulling the blanket lightly over his shoulders. And Ethan stirred briefly but did not wake, his breathing remaining steady. And Amora stepped back quietly, her movements soft, and Daniel watched the entire moment in silence, his expression thoughtful, as the last light of evening touched Ethan's face. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel Whitmore felt the quiet relief of seeing his son resting peacefully, and he remained standing beside the bed, his gaze lingering, as the calm settled deeper into the room. Daniel Whitmore remained beside the bed for several quiet seconds, watching the slow rise and fall of Ethan's chest as if he needed to confirm that the calm was real, and the soft glow from the bedside lamp cast a warm circle of light across the pale blue blanket, softening the sharp edges of the room that usually felt too large for a child, and Amora Johnson stepped back quietly, her hands folded gently in front of her, her movements careful not to disturb the stillness that had settled like a fragile layer across the nursery. And Daniel finally turned slightly toward her, his voice low and thoughtful, asking, "How did you know what to do?" And Amora paused for a moment, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window where the last light of evening faded behind the trees, and she answered softly, "Sometimes children do not need solutions, they just need someone to sit with them until the fear passes." And Daniel studied her expression, noticing the calm certainty in her voice, not rehearsed, not professional, but deeply personal, and he nodded slowly, as if the answer reached somewhere deeper than he expected, and the quiet hum of the air vent filled the space between them while the house settled into evening silence, and Amora glanced once more at Ethan, confirming his steady sleep before turning slightly toward the doorway, her voice gentle as she spoke, "I should return to my duties downstairs, sir." And Daniel hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting from her to Ethan and back again, and he spoke quietly, "You stayed when you did not have to," and Amora gave a small nod, her tone calm. He sounded scared, and Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing the simplicity of her response, and he stepped aside slightly to give her space to pass, and as Amora moved toward the door her footsteps remained soft against the carpet, careful, respectful, and the hallway outside was dimly lit with warm wall lamps casting gentle shadows across the long corridor, and she paused briefly at the doorway, glancing back once more at Ethan before stepping into the hall, and Daniel remained near the bed, his attention still fixed on his sleeping son, and the quiet of the mansion felt different now, less heavy, more settled, as if the tension that had lingered for months had loosened just slightly, and he walked slowly toward the window, looking out across the wide stretch of lawn now tinted in deep evening blue, and the distant lights along the driveway flickered on one by one, and he placed one hand lightly against the back of the rocking chair where Amora had been sitting moments earlier, noticing the gentle sway still fading to stillness, and he stood there silently, reflecting on how effortlessly the calm had entered the room, and down the hallway Amora walked steadily toward the service stairs, her expression composed, but her movements unhurried, and she passed a framed photograph along the wall of the Whitmore family standing together under bright summer sunlight, and she slowed slightly as she noticed Ethan smiling in the picture, his mother kneeling beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, and Amora continued walking, the quiet echo of her steps blending with the soft ticking of the distant clock, and behind her, in the nursery, Daniel Whitmore pulled the blanket slightly higher around Ethan's shoulders, his movements careful and deliberate, and he stood beside the bed for another long moment, watching the peaceful stillness, and the night settled quietly across the estate, carrying with it a calm that had not been felt in the house for a very long time. Amora Johnson moved quietly down the service staircase, her hand gliding lightly along the polished wooden railing as the soft glow of the wall lights followed her descent, and the quiet of the evening settled deeper into the mansion, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint ticking of a clock blending into a calm rhythm, and she stepped into the staff hallway where the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and Mrs. Delaney, the housekeeper who had worked at the Whitmore estate for nearly 15 years, looked up from organizing a stack of folded linens, her eyes immediately searching Amora's face as if trying to read something unspoken, and she lowered her voice gently, asking, "Is he still upset?" And Amora shook her head softly, her tone calm as she answered, "He fell asleep," and Mrs. Delaney paused, her hand still resting on the folded towels, surprise flickering briefly across her expression, and she spoke quietly, "He has not done that in a while," and Amora nodded once, her gaze drifting toward the hallway that led back upstairs, and she stepped toward the sink, rinsing her hands slowly, the warm water running softly, and Mrs. Delaney watched her with quiet curiosity, noticing the calm steadiness in her movements, and she asked gently, "What did you do?" And Amora dried her hands carefully, her voice soft, "I just stayed with him," and Mrs. Delaney gave a small thoughtful nod, as if the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than expected, and outside the kitchen window the night had settled fully, the distant lights along the driveway glowing softly against the darkened trees, and the quiet of the estate felt unusually peaceful, and Amora moved to return the folded cleaning cloths to their place, her steps unhurried, and the faint sound of footsteps approached from the far hallway, and Daniel Whitmore appeared at the entrance of the kitchen, his presence calm but deliberate, and both women straightened slightly in quiet respect, and Daniel's gaze moved briefly from Mrs. Delaney to Amora, his expression thoughtful, and he spoke quietly. "Is everything finished for the evening, and Mrs. Delaney answered respectfully, "Yes, sir," and Daniel nodded slowly before turning his attention fully to Amora, and for a brief moment the room remained silent, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space, and Daniel finally spoke in a measured tone, "You handled him well," and Amora lowered her gaze slightly, her voice calm, "Thank you, sir," and Daniel hesitated as if considering something more, his posture relaxed but thoughtful, and he asked gently, "How long have you been working with children?" And Amora paused briefly, then answered softly, "I used to take care of my son," and the quiet weight of her words settled gently into the room, and Daniel's expression shifted subtly, understanding passing across his face, and he nodded once, absorbing the meaning without asking further, and the silence returned, not uncomfortable, but reflective, and Daniel spoke again, his voice quiet, "If he wakes during the night, would you be available?" And Amora looked up slightly, her expression calm and sincere, "Of course, sir," and Daniel nodded once more, then turned slowly toward the hallway, his footsteps soft as he left the kitchen. And Amora remained still for a moment, her gaze following the direction he had gone, and Mrs. Delaney watched her quietly, a faint smile forming as she returned to folding linens, and the calm of the evening wrapped around the mansion, the quiet deeper now, as if something gentle had begun to change within the walls of the Whitmore home. The night settled deeper across the Whitmore estate, and the house moved into a quieter rhythm as the last staff lights dimmed along the lower hallway, while Amora Johnson finished arranging the folded linens in the storage cabinet, her movement slow and deliberate, and the distant sound of wind brushing against the tall windows carried faintly through the quiet kitchen, and Mrs. Delaney gave her a gentle nod before stepping away toward the staff quarters, leaving Amora alone in the soft glow of the overhead lights, and she paused for a moment, her hands resting lightly against the cool marble countertop, listening to the stillness that filled the space, and somewhere upstairs the faint creak of wood echoed softly, the house adjusting to the night, and Amora moved toward the small staff sitting area, lowering herself into the chair near the window, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she remained quietly present even while resting, and outside the wide glass pane the long driveway lights stretched in a gentle curve across the dark lawn, their warm glow reflecting faintly against the trimmed hedges, and the quiet felt peaceful, but not empty, more like a calm breath settling across the home, and after a few minutes the faint sound of footsteps approached again from the main hallway, measured and quiet, and Daniel Whitmore appeared once more, his expression thoughtful, his movement slower now as if the calm of the evening had softened his usual urgency, and he paused briefly when he saw Amora seated by the window, and she stood respectfully, her voice gentle, "Is everything all right, sir?" And Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze shifting toward the darkened hallway before returning to her. "He is still sleeping," he said quietly, and Amora gave a small nod, her expression calm, "That is good," and Daniel stepped closer, his hands resting loosely at his sides, and for a moment he seemed to search for words, then he spoke softly, "The house feels different tonight," and Amora glanced briefly toward the ceiling above them, as if sensing the quiet change as well. "Sometimes peace arrives quietly," she replied, and Daniel absorbed her words, his shoulders relaxing slightly, and he moved toward the window, standing beside her as they both looked out at the softly lit driveway, and the distant sound of wind moved gently through the trees, and the silence between them felt comfortable, unforced, and Daniel finally spoke again, his voice thoughtful, "You said you used to take care of your son," and Amora nodded once, her gaze still resting outside. "Yes, sir," and Daniel hesitated gently, then asked, "How old was he?" And Amora answered softly, 5, and the quiet weight of her response settled into the room, and Daniel nodded slowly, understanding without pressing further, and the clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking the hour, and the sound carried gently through the house, and Amora folded her hands calmly, her breathing steady, and Daniel remained beside the window for a moment longer before speaking again. "If he wakes, I would like you to be the one he sees," and Amora turned slightly, her expression sincere, "I will be nearby," and Daniel gave a small nod of appreciation, then stepped back toward the hallway, his footsteps quiet as he disappeared into the dim light, and Amora returned to her seat by the window, the gentle glow of the driveway lights reflecting in the glass. And the Whitmore estate rested in a rare calm, the kind that felt fragile yet hopeful, as the night carried forward in quiet stillness. The house remained quiet as the night deepened, and the soft glow of the driveway lights stretched longer shadows across the polished floors, while Amora Johnson sat near the window in the staff sitting area, her hands resting calmly in her lap, listening to the gentle hum of the house settling into sleep, and the faint sound of wind brushing the tall trees outside created a soft rhythm that blended with the ticking clock down the hallway, and several minutes passed in stillness before a faint sound echoed from upstairs, subtle at first, like a floorboard shifting. Then another soft sound, lighter, uncertain, and Amora lifted her head slightly, her attention sharpening without urgency, and she rose quietly from the chair, moving toward the hallway with careful steps, her shoes barely making a sound against the carpet, and the staircase ahead was dimly lit by small wall lamps casting warm pools of light, and she climbed slowly, her hand resting lightly along the railing, listening. And as she reached the upper hallway she heard it again, a small, restless sound coming from the nursery, and she moved closer, her steps gentle, and the door to the nursery was slightly open, the warm bedside lamp still glowing softly inside, and Ethan Whitmore shifted in his bed, his small hand moving across the blanket as if searching for something familiar, and his breathing had changed, no longer deep and steady, but lighter, uncertain, and Amora stepped quietly into the room, her presence calm and unhurried, and she approached the bed slowly, kneeling slightly beside him, and Ethan's eyes fluttered open halfway, his expression confused in the dim light, and he looked around softly before his gaze settled on Amora, and the tension in his small shoulders eased just slightly, and Amora spoke in a gentle whisper, "It is all right, you are safe," and she rested her hand lightly on the edge of the mattress, not touching him directly, allowing him space while remaining present, and Ethan blinked slowly, his breathing beginning to steady again, and he shifted closer to the edge of the bed, his small fingers reaching toward the blanket, and Amora gently adjusted it, tucking it lightly around him, and the quiet of the room deepened once more, and behind her, Daniel Whitmore appeared quietly at the doorway, his silhouette framed by the hallway light, and he paused, watching the gentle interaction, his expression softening as he observed Ethan's calm returning, and Amora remained still, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, and Ethan's eyes slowly closed again, his breathing smoothing into a gentle rhythm, and Daniel stepped slightly into the room, careful not to disturb the quiet. And he watched as the calm settled once more, and Amora remained beside the bed for another moment before slowly rising, her movements gentle, and she turned slightly, noticing Daniel standing quietly nearby, and their eyes met briefly, and Daniel gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful and quietly grateful, and Amora returned the nod softly, and she stepped back toward the doorway, leaving Ethan resting peacefully once more, and the soft light of the bedside lamp cast a warm glow across the room. And Daniel remained beside the bed, watching his son breathe steadily, while the quiet calm filled the nursery again, deeper now, like a fragile piece learning to stay. Daniel Whitmore remained beside Ethan's bed as the quiet settled deeper into the nursery, the warm bedside lamp casting a gentle glow across the soft blue blanket while the faint movement of tree branches outside created shifting shadows along the walls, and Ethan's breathing stayed calm and even, his small hand resting loosely near his cheek, and Daniel slowly lowered himself into the rocking chair near the window, the same chair Amora Johnson had used earlier, and he felt the faint warmth still lingering in the fabric, as if the calm she carried had not fully left the room, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on his son, and for the first time in weeks the tension in his shoulders softened, replaced by a quiet relief he had almost forgotten, and outside the sky deepened into midnight blue while the distant lights along the driveway glowed softly against the dark landscape, and Daniel rested his hands lightly on the armrests, listening to the stillness and the quiet creak of the chair moved gently as he shifted forward, and his eyes drifted briefly toward the framed photograph on the dresser again, the image of Ethan's mother smiling in sunlight, her presence captured in a moment that felt both close and distant, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the memory passing quietly through him, and he glanced toward the doorway where Amora had stood moments before, and he realized how naturally Ethan had calmed in her presence, how effortlessly the room had changed, and the thought settled deeper than he expected. And after a few minutes Daniel rose quietly from the chair, stepping closer to the bed to adjust the blanket slightly around Ethan's shoulders, his movements careful and gentle, and Ethan stirred lightly but did not wake, and Daniel allowed himself a small breath of reassurance before stepping back toward the door, and in the hallway the lights were dim, the carpet soft beneath his steps, and he paused briefly, glancing toward the staircase where he knew Amora would still be nearby, and the quiet of the mansion felt steady now. Less fragile, more settled, and downstairs Amora sat again near the window, her posture relaxed yet attentive, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the driveway lights, and she listened to the distant silence of the house, sensing the calm that had returned, and a few moments later Daniel descended the staircase slowly, his steps measured, and when he reached the bottom he paused near the sitting area, and Amora rose gently, her expression calm, and Daniel spoke quietly. He went back to sleep, and Amora nodded softly. That is good, and the silence between them felt warm and respectful, and Daniel hesitated slightly before speaking again, his tone thoughtful. He seems to trust you, and Amora answered gently. Sometimes children recognize kindness before adults do, and Daniel absorbed her words, the quiet truth settling into the moment, and he gave a small nod, his expression softened, and after a pause he spoke again. I would like you to stay close tonight, and Amora nodded calmly. I will remain nearby. And Daniel gave a quiet nod of appreciation before turning back toward the staircase, his footsteps soft as he returned upstairs, and Amora resumed her seat by the window, the night continuing in gentle stillness, and throughout the Whitmore estate the calm remained, deeper now, as if the house itself had learned to breathe again. Morning arrived quietly across the Whitmore estate, and the first pale sunlight stretched gently across the long driveway, reflecting softly against the tall windows while the early breeze moved through the oak trees, carrying a calm stillness that felt different from the restless mornings before. And inside the nursery Ethan Whitmore remained asleep, his breathing slow and even beneath the soft blue blanket, and Daniel Whitmore stood near the window, watching the sunlight slowly brighten the room, his posture relaxed, his shoulders no longer tense, and the faint creak of the hallway floor signaled quiet movement outside, and Amora Johnson stepped softly into the doorway, her presence calm and unobtrusive, and Daniel turned slightly, noticing her, and she spoke gently, "Good morning, sir," and Daniel nodded quietly, his voice soft. He slept through the night, and Amora's expression warmed slightly. "That is wonderful." And Ethan shifted gently in his sleep, the morning light touching his face, and Daniel watched closely as his son stirred, his eyes fluttering open slowly, and for a brief moment Ethan looked around quietly, adjusting to the light, and then his gaze moved toward Daniel and then toward Amora standing near the doorway, and something softened in his small expression, and he pushed himself up slightly, his voice still sleepy, asking softly, "You stayed?" And Amora stepped closer, her tone warm and gentle. "I stayed nearby," and Ethan relaxed, pulling the blanket slightly closer around his shoulders, and Daniel watched the exchange quietly, the calm interaction settling deeply within him, and Ethan leaned back against the pillow, no longer restless, no longer searching, and the quiet peace filled the room as sunlight spread across the floor, and Daniel stepped closer to the bed, resting his hand gently along the edge, and he spoke softly, "How do you feel?" And Ethan gave a small nod, "Okay." And the simple answer carried more relief than Daniel expected, and Amora adjusted the curtains slightly, allowing the morning light to brighten the room, and outside the lawn glowed in soft golden tones, and the house felt awake but peaceful, and Daniel turned toward Amora, his expression thoughtful, and he spoke quietly, "Thank you," and Amora lowered her gaze slightly, her voice calm, "I am glad he is resting," and Daniel nodded slowly, and after a brief pause he added, "I would like you to continue working closely with Ethan," and Amora looked up gently, surprised but composed, and she nodded. "I would be honored," and Ethan watched quietly from the bed, his expression calm, and the moment settled into a quiet understanding, and Daniel stepped back slightly, looking once more at his son resting peacefully in the morning light, and the Whitmore estate felt warmer now, the silence no longer heavy but gentle, and Amora moved toward the doorway, her steps quiet, and Ethan's eyes followed her briefly before he relaxed again against the pillow, and Daniel stood beside the bed, watching the sunlight fill the room, and for the first time in a long while the morning arrived without tension, without uncertainty, only a quiet calm that settled softly across the home as the day began.